Okay, hey, welcome everyone. In this classroom session, I wanted to briefly discuss everything about lenses because that's going to be the focus of this week, and we're going to be scene building. So a bit of knowledge about lenses is always a good thing. Again, I'm not an authority when it comes to lenses. I'm definitely not an expert, but it's just from my observation and what the correlation that I make between lenses and perspective that might be able to help you in your own drawing. And so what we'll do is we're going to look at why different lenses are used. So I have some movie examples here, but the same thing goes for animation or even art. I'm going to show some art later in the classroom. So we're going to make a distinct difference why there's a difference in the use of lenses, and then see what the correlation is between lenses and perspective. And then we're going to see how you can actually apply that in your own scenes as you'll be able to do this assignment cycle. All right, so jumping right into it, why do we use different lenses? Well, the thing is, as storytellers or, artists, whether that's cinematography, photography, 2D artists, doesn't really matter. We're always trying to make our audience connect with what we're displaying, whether that's emotionally or, personally or visually. We're always trying to convey a certain feeling, okay? And so we can do this in a number of different ways, as you all know, right? We can do that through mood, color, composition, whatever. And so this is things that help us make that image clear. But we can also do it through lenses, and that's of course specifically with cinematography because they actually use physical lenses. But we can use perspective in a manner that mimics those lens behaviors, okay? And so if we look at a wide-angle lens, what it basically does is it gives us the opportunity to get really close to a certain subject, but still make us aware of the surroundings of that subject, right? And what that is able to do is, when it comes to actors, for instance, as you can see in this scene, it gives us the opportunity to really show the emotion of the actor while still informing us about the environment in which that actor sits. Okay, and this is the same for your subject or your character that you're painting in your illustration. If you're using a wide-angle view, you can still inform the viewer of the surroundings in which your character or characters are standing without too much loss of detail, right? If we'll look at the long lens later, but if we compare that to the long lens, which we can also zoom into a character, everything else gets really blurred. So we're not really getting informed about the surroundings. We're really focused on the character at hand. So the wide-angle lens is actually a pretty informative lens. It also warps our perspective, of course, so it gets a very fantastical feeling. We can see, especially with the wide-angle lens, we can see that it's not real, okay? It's not natural to our eyes. It's something that's there to invoke some kind of drama and inform us about the scene, especially if you look at this scene from Reservoir Dogs. The intent here is to feel as if you are lying in the back of this car, in the trunk, while still seeing all three characters in the scene, somewhat of the environment, and also just the hood of that trunk, right? That's almost impossible to do with any other kind of lens. So we're getting a whole lot of information in just one image. Now, if we then go to a standard or medium lens, when we talk about standard or medium lenses, photographers or cinematographers usually range that between a 35 millimeter to a 70, but probably less than 70 millimeter lens. And so what this does, according to experts, is it mimics our natural view or our natural point of view that we have as humans, like the best, right? It's the closest that we can get to our natural viewing point. And so what this does is that it immerses us in the scene as if we are part of it, right? As if we are standing in the scene or sitting in the scene or actually participating in the scene. Whereas with the wide angle, we're more overlooking the scene, or, you know, being a somewhat of a spectator, but we're not actually participating in the scene, right? And so, as you'll see in cinematography, what they'll often do is that when we have intense conversations between characters, or they want to evoke some kind of emotional response from the viewer, they'll use these lenses in order to immerse you in the scene as if you're part of it, right? Because that makes us connect with the scene much more, as if instead of when we're just, you know, looking over the scene. And then going to the long lens, again, what the long lens does, it's also a type of manipulation of reality, right? So it's not actually what we see with our natural eye. It's also a compression of reality. Now, where the wide-angle lens gives us a very, very distorted view of reality with a lot of depth creation, the long lens actually compresses a lot of our depth. And what that does, when a lot of things get compressed, because there's a really long lens, because if you want to shoot something with this lens, you have to take a long distance from the subject. And we'll look at that a bit after in the next slide. But so you have to really increase your distance to the subject, and that compresses the depth between the elements in the scene. And so what that does is it creates a sense of drama, and especially for cinematographers, but also in art, as I'll show examples later, is that it's a really nice excuse to start playing with composition, because we are moving much more into the graphic realm of things instead of just creating a scene, right? It's actually the placement of elements becomes increasingly important in these long lens shots, because we need to frame our subjects, because we don't have the luxury of depth, right? And so what this does is it creates a lot of drama, especially suspense when you do a close-up on a character like you see here, or it creates something really nice and graphically, as you can see here, where everything is carefully thought out about how this scene should look and where the elements are placed. And so if we zoom out again, and we look at the goal of each one, is that a wide angle is mostly used for like interaction with the audience, where the motion is primarily in relation to the surrounding. And so what you'll often see, especially when a movie begins or a new scene begins, you'll have what they call an establishing shot. And an establishing shot is made usually with a wide-angle lens, because it gives us an overview, a wide overview of everything in the scene, the surrounding, the environment, wherever we are. And it gives us as much information as it can about that surrounding, right? And so that's why they call it an establishing shot. And so that's a very informative sort of view. And then when we go into the standard medium, it's more about connection with the viewer itself, with your audience, right? You want to make a personal connection, a very emotional connection. So it's an emotion in relation to other people. And then with the long lens, we are really doing that for drama and appeal. So the emotion is in relation to the situation or others. Now, the appeal comes to, and a lot of directors say this, when you want to make your actors look appealing or, very attractive, they often opt for a long lens, because it kills the depth of the image, which makes facial features a lot more symmetrical and nice looking. And so that's why actors look more appealing in those long lens compressed shots. And like with the arrow, what I did, that, as you can see down below, is that from wide angle to long lenses, we go from being very informative to more graphic, right? Now, I'm not saying that wide angle lenses can be graphic. They certainly can be, but it becomes increasingly important with a long lens to make a very nice graphic composition. And we'll see this in an example later on. Is so far everything clear? Okay, good. All right, then let's look at lens comparison. First and foremost, let's give credit where credit is due. I mainly copied this image. I recreated it from Framed Perspective Volume 1 or Framed Ink, where they go a lot more in depth about these things. But I think this is a really nice way to explain it. So with a wide-angle lens, if the circle is the viewer or the camera and the black bar is the subject, and the triangle is our field of view, basically, this is what all of those, or how all of those lenses behave. And we call it a wide angle because the field of view is maybe like a 70 degree, it's much higher than the standard lens or the long lens, right? So our field of view becomes larger. And so it gives more information. And the cool thing about a wide angle lens is also that our camera can be really close to the subject, right? It doesn't need to be far from it in order to capture it. Whereas with the standard medium lens, we need to take some distance from it before we can frame it completely within our, canvas, which is more of a natural view. And then with the long lens, we need to take a really long distance before we can really crop our subject within our frame. Now, the reason why everything in a long lens gets compressed so much is has to do with focal length. So focal length is basically the depth at which the camera can keep things in focus. So the camera's here, and so there's a lot of real estate between the camera and the subject. So every object that is sitting between the subject that needs to be in focus and the camera, right, can be random things, they are all going to be out of focus, right? And everything behind that is going to be out of focus as well, right? Because the depth of field, or the focal length, sorry, is not as big with a long lens. It's a little bigger with the standard medium lens, and it's a lot bigger with a wide angle lens because our camera is so close to the subject. Everything else that is sitting in the scene is somewhat going to be in focus. Not super sharp, but it is going to be in focus. And so a good example of this, for instance, is if you look at sports photography or wildlife photography, the photographers use these really, really long lenses, right? And so when you see those photographs, you see the subject, like maybe a lion or a giraffe, it's super sharp in focus, but everything else around it is blurry, right? To really keep your focus on the subject. And that's usually made with a long lens, right? Because it's the focal length is only for that camera to be on this subject, and everything else in the scene is just blurry. All right, so that's the correlation. No, that's not the correlation. The correlation is going to be... So what's the relation between perspective and lenses then, right? So that's our real question, because as artists, we don't have the luxury of using lenses unless we use 3D, where we can mimic lenses. We need to kind of mimic it ourselves. All right, so in this example, I drew 3 faces that are shot in different lenses. Now, as you can see, with a wide angle lens, everything will get very, very distorted. And depending on the feature that is going to be in focus, everything surrounding that feature is going to get most distortion. And the reason that is because basically the wide angle lens, especially a fisheye lens, which I kind of mimicked here, behaves like a 5-point perspective. And I know that to some of you that might sound like something that is mind-blowingly hard to do, because we have 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, and then we have 5-point perspective. And 5-point perspective is basically spherical perspective. What that means is that every line in the scene is converging. So from top to bottom, we are converging. From left to right, we're converging. And we have a 1-point perspective in the center. So we're also converging towards one vanishing point. Right, and this is basically how a fisheye perspective works, or a 5-point perspective. And this is where you see guys like Kim Young-ji drawing a lot. The reason why he does that is because he can put a lot of things in one scene, right? And as we said before in the previous slides, if you want to make things the most informative, you use a wide-angle lens. And that's why his illustrations still look natural while the perspective is pretty warped, right? Because from what we see from wide-angle lenses is that it's very informative and it shows a lot of detail within a certain area. All right. And so the standard medium lens is how we perceive reality most of the time. So it's going to have a pretty natural feeling, whereas the long lens is going to be very compressed. So it can be very appealing depending on, you know, what your taste is. But the main thing is that the main thing in the standard and the medium lens is going to be the convergence, right? And we can compare a medium lens to a very normal sort of convergence where we have a vanishing point that is, if we have our horizon line, we have a vanishing point that is pretty close, and we have one that is somewhat further away, but not very far, right? So our two vanishing points are still pretty close together with a standard medium lens. Whereas with the long lens, those vanishing points are super far apart, right? To the point where we, especially when we go into like the 200 millimeter lenses, the convergence isn't even apparent anymore, right? So, and that's what we're trying to do when we're drawing in a long lens perspective, is that the convergence of my features isn't going to be very apparent. Whereas with the standard lens, we still have that, you know, convergence. If we look at it in terms of ellipses, right? The convergence is still pretty apparent. And so that's what we need to keep in mind when we're drawing in different lenses. So again, with a wide angle lens, the convergence is almost super fast, right? You can think of it like an extreme 3-point perspective where everything is converging really fast to vanishing points that are pretty close together, right? Same here, vanishing points. Right, so my vanishing points are really close together, and that's how we can mimic a wide-angle lens. It doesn't always have to be a fisheye. It can be a 3-point perspective, but with pretty fast converging vanishing points. And so with the standard medium lens, we can still push it a little bit, we can sometimes make it a 3-point, but a lot of the times it's going to be like a 2-point perspective with some faster convergence. And with the long lens, it's going to be a 2-point or a 1-point perspective with almost no convergence. There's still going to be convergence, otherwise it's like isometric perspective, which doesn't really look natural. But with the long lenses, the convergence is going to be very, very, very slow, and so we'll need to rely more on our graphic composition of the image. Does that make sense so far? I'm just awaiting your responses if there might be a question. Okay, good. So again, to recap, the main difference between wide angle, standard, and long lens is going to be the rate of convergence, let's call it, right? So with wide angle, is going to be a lot of convergence, very fast. So your vanishing points are going to be pretty close together, and you're usually going to be in the range of like a 5-point perspective to a 3-point perspective, right? Let's make a note here. So we're going to have 5 or 3-point, whereas with the standard medium, we're going to be in the 3 to 2-point perspective range, with some faster convergence, definitely on one vanishing point, and with maybe some slower convergence on one. But the vanishing points are still going to be somewhat close together. And with the long lens, we are dabbling in the like 2-point to 1-point perspective range with very, very slow convergence. All right. Now, if we look at the application on Canvas, because that's your assignment for this week, is you guys are going to try and make a narrative, and then you're going to build that scene. Now, from this classroom session, what I want you to take away from it, other than the correlation between perspective and wide angle, is primarily why we are using certain lenses. Because if you're in tune with that, then art directors are going to pick up on that, right? So your storytelling will get better, especially visually. And so primarily any of you that want to go into storyboarding or stuff like that, it will be very, very useful to know your lenses and even to be able to mimic that on paper, because it will make the life of the DP, the director of photography, a lot easier. Anytime you can make someone's life easier, you have a better chance of getting employed. That's the gist of it. So when you're writing out this narrative that I want you to do for this assignment week, depending on the narrative, you should ask yourself, what am I trying to convey in this scene, and how do I want my audience to connect with this scene, right? So for instance, the example that I gave you guys in the instruction video is we have an arms dealer, and it's for a card game. So we have an arms dealer that is it's a deal card, so you can purchase a lot of items in that scene, but I still want to have focus on the character. So my goal here is to be informative, but also have some detail, right? And so I choose a wide angle lens. Now, mind you, I'm not always thinking about this consciously. Sometimes it's very intuitive, but again, if you have this knowledge in the back of your head, it will probably help you a lot. So I'm trying to be informative and still get a good read on the emotion of the character, right? His evil face or his grinchy, smirky face. So I still want to keep that in frame. So I'm choosing a wide angle lens because I need to, show all the weaponry and, even a bit of the environment that he's in. And so a wide angle lens permits me to show all this in still a somewhat of an appealing way. Because if we try to do this in a standard or medium lens, right? The problem with this setup if I choose the exact same angle, but I do a standard medium lens, the shot would look somewhat the same, right? I can still have focus on my character, and I can still, to some degree, show most of the elements in the scene. Probably not as many, but I can still show a good amount of them. The problem is that because of this natural view, the viewer or the audience might experience this as if they are they are immersed in the scene, and they're looking to this character as if they are standing on a stool or something, or looking through a peephole to this character. And if this is the intent of your design, then that's good, but it's not the intent of my design. So if I wanted to make this scene a lot more immersive in a standard lens, it would be better for me to opt for something like this, where we pull everything to eye height, where you feel as if you're sitting at this guy's desk. You're not part of the conversation, but you're a spectator. You're like an invisible guy sitting at this desk, and you're witnessing the scene. Now, of course, then it will be again harder to display all of the items in the scene. It's not as informative, right? It's more immersive, and it's more like an emotional connection. If we wanted to convey the scene in a long lens, we could do that as well, but then the narrative would be completely different, right? It would become a little more cinematic, where you maybe have like, you're stepping into this door. It's a very creepy environment. This guy is sitting in the middle, very graphically, right? To pull our attention, and we have intentionally placed things, like there could be like something hanging on the wall here, to frame our character. Right? Everything would be graphical and intentional in order to frame our character. And then what they might do in like a shot sequence is that they would zoom in, right? And give us a nice and appealing shot of our bad guy, of our arms dealer, with a lot of focus on his emotion, but everything else in the scene would be blurred, right? So the focus would really be on his emotion and how you read that emotion. So again, it's a very immersive feeling, but it's more graphic, and it's more drama, and it's appeal, and it's very cinematic. Yeah, you wouldn't do that with the 3/4 angle in a long lens, because it would look very, very warped. You would even lose your sense of believability. That's why the long lens is primarily used for graphical purposes, and why a lot of the times it's only shot in like, straight into the actor's eyes, or on a building or something, that you can place elements in the scene, but you're not trying to convey perspective and depth with a long lens, because then you're using the wrong lens. Right, and that's why I'm saying, and that's why I, intentionally rotated the camera angle, because if you're going to use a long lens, you're going to use graphical leading lines. All right, and then lastly, let's look at some artist examples of effective use of these lenses. So as you can see, and you probably know this guy, he's called Ramon Nunez. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but all credit goes to that artist. So what he tends to do, or he likes to do, is use a lot of wide-angle lenses. And the reason he does that is because he can show a lot of information in the scene, still get a good focus on his character and his character expressions, but also show a lot of the environment, right? Get you immersed into the environment, not as if you're a part of this scene, but just as a spectator, that you can witness everything in the environment. So he's basically showcasing his actors as well as the scene itself. So everything has a certain level of importance, but he still wants to keep focus on the emotion of the character without losing detail in the environment. And then with the standard medium lens, for instance, these images from Spart some of you might argue that this one is more of a wide angle shot, but what I tend to see from Spart is that he uses somewhat of a normal view, whereas you feel immersed into the scene and you're like the guy that is backpacking behind these guys or following these guys, and you're witnessing the scene yourself, right? So he's not using that much of a convergence, but he's also not using very graphically long lenses. Sometimes he does, but in these two images he doesn't. So it's a much more immersive scene, and you feel like you're in there witnessing the scenery. Same as mine. It's a very normal type of convergence, very normal lens, and you feel like you're hidden between these books, for instance, witnessing this going on. You might be like this goblin guy, like a third goblin guy that's just sitting here between the books, overwatching the scene. So you're feeling immersed into the scene. And then lastly, these are from Raphael Lacoste. The other ones were from Spart, by the way. All credit goes to the artist. Same here for Raphael Lacoste. So what he likes to do many of the times is that he uses very, very graphic imagery, right? So it's a very long lens. There's almost no sense of perspective. It's just very graphically placed. Very appealing. Lots of drama. Really good shots, a lot of play. In order to create some depth, he's playing with light and layers, and mood, but it's very graphical, very appealing. And so this is what you can call a long lens, because there's basically almost no convergence, right? All these lines are almost not converting. They are converting that way to some degree, but even then it's a very, very slow convergence. And I believe that's it. Let's see. Yep. A question. How do you learn to see that? I had huge troubles telling wide from standard apart in these examples. Well, it's the amount of convergence primarily. As always, it has to do with experience, but it's very apparent to my estimation what the difference is. If you look at the convergence here with the wide angle, you can see these lines converging really fast to a 3-point perspective. Right, and these lines are converging somewhat fast, and even these lines are converging very fast, right? So all the lines are converging pretty fast, whereas with the standard lens, there's no convergence on the verticals. When is it appropriate to use long lenses in environment shots like Raphael? It seems to have strong impact, but it appears to have problems in communicating effective design. It doesn't really... That depends on the shot, on the design, Gabriel. But it's not made for structural design. It's very, very graphic, right? So you're gonna accomplish your scenes a lot more using graphically placed elements in the scene, good lighting, good use of layers, foreground, midground, background, and leading lines, stuff like that. So your focus is a lot more on composition instead of your structure, right? It's not that heavy on perspective. Okay. Do we have any other questions? Is it correct to assume that wide lens is more suited to interiors then? Well, Sonar, to a certain degree, yes. That's why you see You'll see this a lot in the FCD student examples. They almost always use very fast converging three-point perspectives because they want to cram as much information as they can within the interior cutout shots. So yes, they'll use a lot more wide-angle views in order to give you the most amount of information. But it's not necessary. For instance, if you want to make a more narrative view where you feel immersed into the environment, whether that's interior or exterior, you'll use a more standard lens. All right, any further questions? Yes, it always comes down to intent. Question: do the lenses describe the perspective? Example: long lens cannot have 3-point and wide lens can only be 3 to 5 points. Yes, Mac, that's what I was explaining in the correlation between perspective and lenses. Just rewatch the this video when I upload it, and it'll hopefully become more clear. For environment design, if you're to showcase a scene for a 3D modeler, you would prefer a standard to wide lens illustration. Oh, okay. According to resources that are not mine, but they usually stamp a wide-angle lens anything from 35 millimeters below. So that's usually 35, 24, 18, 16, 10, 8, etc. And standard is 35 to 70. And then long lenses are 70 upwards. You can go all the way to 600 if you want to, but that's rarely used. It's mostly between 70 and 200. All right, I'm gonna close it off here. Thank you all for attending.